Hi, this is a quick, just off the cuff kind of rant video about the real estate and housing crisis in Canada. I've made some of these videos and posted them before. I know they're kind of off topic for me because I usually talk about the gender mess, but the situation in Canada with real estate and the cost of living is so out of control. It's so out of control and it's so fundamentally broken. I can't stop ranting about it because I don't know how it's going to be fixed. It's just so broken. So take a look at this headline from today. Do you see that? Ontario landlord posts ad charging $500 for tent space in a private encampment. Not only was the ad posted, but there were services for homeless people who were referring homeless people to this place. So now people are literally renting out space in their backyard for homeless people to camp out and charging them rent. That is a sign of the catastrophic crisis going on with the cost of living in Canada right now. There have been headlines around the world about how the cost of rent and the cost of housing in Canada, in Toronto specifically, but in Canada as a whole, is now among the highest in the world. Toronto is more expensive than New York City now in terms of cost of living. And our wages are nowhere near the wages in the United States and certainly nowhere near the wages in New York City. The problem is that the entire economy of Canada revolves around real estate investment. I mean, this has happened to some degree in many other countries in the United States and the United Kingdom. In many countries in the West have this problem where their sort of gross national product, their GDP, revolves around their wealth that they're building as a nation, at least on paper, comes from increasing real estate value. But that can't work forever. And it's not the way all countries works. There are some countries like Italy and Japan that have fundamentally different economic systems and they treat real estate very, very differently within them. But here in Canada, there has been an extreme focus on real estate investment to build wealth. This has come from foreign investors from around the world, but it's also come just from within the country. Many Canadians choose to try to make money and build their nest eggs and to save for retirement, not through employment, not through going to work every day, but through real estate investment. And this has become such a huge part of the entire country now that many people who do work for the real estate sector. And it's just that real estate has just completely taken over the entire economy of the country. And it's out of control. The very idea that real estate can build generational wealth is flawed as a premise right from the outset. We have to go back a few generations to sort of look at what I mean. If you look at people do this all the time where they talk about how households functioned in the 1950s and then in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and now how back in the 1950s, on a medium living wage, like a medium income, the median income in the United States or in Canada, you could buy a house, you could raise two kids, put them through college, and you could buy two cars. And then by the 90s, that was not even remotely possible. And then by now, that's not even remotely possible. But the reason for that is that the cost of real estate keeps going up because we have built this idea, this fantasy that we can build generational wealth through our real estate investment. So in the 1950s, a household with one income, a single income household where the wife stays at home and runs the house, and the husband is the breadwinner and goes out and works a median income, white collar job, or even perhaps a blue collar job, could be bringing home enough money in his income, in his median income job, normal everyday job, to pay the mortgage on the house, to buy even two cars perhaps, and to raise two children and to put them through college. That was the kind of a median household income was enough to live a middle class life in the 50s and 60s. But those houses that they all invested in, they went up so much in value that by, say, the 90s, the next generation, their kids, they couldn't afford to buy a house on a single income. The cost of housing was so much higher by then that what ended up happening is that you needed dual incomes to pay for the same amount of housing. And that just happened to coincide with civil rights and with feminist movement and everything else, that suddenly women were entering into the working world as well. But what that meant was that the first generation from the 50s and 60s who bought these homes, in order for those homes to double in value, there has to be someone who is able to buy them. And the only way to make these homes worth twice as much so that people can buy them in the next generation is to have everyone's income relative to the value of the homes. If a home is worth twice as much compared to the living wage, then there have to be two living wages to pay for each one home, which is exactly what happened. Now you had dual income families who are just barely scraping enough to purchase a home. So this is what happens when you're trying to double or even exponentially increase the value of homes from one generation to the next in order to build wealth relative to living wages. The only way to do that is to make each subsequent generation work harder for the same amount of real estate. And in the past, there have been different ways of doing that, different ways to keep this sort of ball rolling, to exponentially increase the value of everybody's real estate relative to a living wage, so that the homes that they invested in previous generations are worth astronomically more in future generations. So they've done that by doubling the amount of wages required to buy a home, like I said. Now, both parents in any family household need to work, usually, to own a home or to buy a home. Another way to do it is to double the catchment area in whatever real estate zone you're in. So if you're in a big city and you buy a house and you want that house to be worth twice as much for the next generation, you expand the sort of desirability of that neighborhood, that city that your house is in, to bring in more people. So now it's a more exclusive area. That's one way to increase the viability, the viability of the value of your house. That's been done already. And then the next thing you could do is to open up to foreign investors. So now the cost of housing in London, England, for example, or in Manhattan, and now in Toronto and Vancouver as well, and most of Canada, the only way for previous generations with dual Canadian incomes to double the value or to exponentially increase the value of their investments so that someone else could buy them is to bring in the ultra rich from entirely other countries, to go global, to expand the catchment area, to capture the elite, the financial elite and the wealthiest across the globe. So you've got not so much Russian investors in Canada like they have in the UK. It's mostly Chinese investors and investors in India. The wealthiest of the wealthy in other countries are being marketed to move to Canada because our quality of living is supposedly so much higher here. And that is what's keeping the real estate market afloat, international wealthy investors. This can't keep going forever. We have now run out of ways to bring in new markets so that we can continually double the value of real estate. What they're trying to do now, the government of Canada just introduced the fourplex policy. Have you heard of this? Where the federal government is providing incentives to all municipalities across the country to change their zoning laws so that regular housing on regular residential streets can be rezoned to split houses into quarters. So that's yet another way you can increase the value of your property from one generation to the next, is to split it in half. If you can't just double the amount of wages required to buy a home, you can split the home in half. So now it's two homes. So a home that one single person bought in the 1950s, by the 1990s, he'd sell it to two people with two incomes combined to pay for it. And then that generation, they'd split the house into two so that they could now sell it to two groups of two people, so that now there are four sets of income that can afford to buy that house. And then the next thing they're trying to do is split a house not just into two, but into four. These are called fourplexes. You can see this is the next step. The only way to keep the real estate system going of exponential growth is to constantly find new ways to make units, cut them in half, and to bring more income into one real estate housing unit. I know I'm stuttering and fumbling a bit here, but you see what I mean. I think this makes sense. It's now gotten to the point where the federal government is ordering or bribing municipalities across the country to legislate their municipal bylaws to rezone them so that houses can be split now into four, so that four sets of dual income households might be able to buy those homes. All of this is in the service of keeping this system going, where from one generation to the next, the value of real estate doubles or more relative to the living wage. Before the 1950s, I don't think real estate was exponentially growing like that. I think from the 20s to the 30s to the 40s to the 50s, housing and real estate appreciated in value along the lines that wages and the GDP in general did. Or at least it wasn't this exponential splitting of it. I think if you had a median income in 1930, you could probably buy the same kind of house ish that you could in 1950. I don't know the whole ins and outs of the economy. There's a recession in there and there was a war and everything else, but more or less there wasn't this massive split between what a living wage is and what the cost of owning a home is, the way there has been in Canada and in the United States and in the UK and other countries as well, but far worse in Canada than almost any other country. I think Australia is in the same kind of crisis, and Australia is having the same problem that Canada is, where we're describing the issue as a matter of lack of housing stock availability or too much immigration. There's a big problem in Canada that's compounding the issue, is that we have set the bar. In Canada, we have a very strict control over the dial of immigration. We can calculate exactly the number of people we want to let into the country at any given time based on a whole slew of metrics that we control very, very precisely, like amount of education, type of jobs we require to be filled, and job qualifications that immigration applicants have, et cetera, et cetera. And we've set those dials really, really high. We've cranked them up to bring in hundreds of thousands, record numbers of people every year. For the past several years, the federal government has done that, jacked up our quotas for immigration in an effort to boost the economy, and again, an effort to bring in more people to pay for these houses that are constantly going up in price. So the whole, like, that's not the problem though. Like, bringing in too many people is compounding the cost of housing and compounding the cost of rent, and but that's not the main problem. And so is like lack of enough housing construction, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that housing has to go back down in price. We've doubled and then doubled and then doubled and then doubled again the cost of a unit of housing, any unit of housing across the country. We've shrunken them in size. We've completely disconnected them from the wage levels across the country. And we've reached the end of the line. There's no way to keep this going anymore. Right now, in Toronto, it costs over $1 million to buy one of the smallest units of housing possible. It's just crazy. We keep making the units smaller and smaller and smaller and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And we keep jacking up the prices more and more and more because our entire economy doesn't want to work, doesn't want to do labor to produce GDP anymore, to produce value. They want to invest in real estate instead. The system has to collapse. We need to cut all housing costs in half, if not by 2/3. That means every mortgage in the entire country has to fall apart, has to collapse. It sounds crazy, but there's no other way I can see moving forward. Right now, this problem of all of these people investing so much money in mortgages that are the titles on ever smaller units that were only ever designed to be investment units. There's no one who can move into these units. No one can afford the rents. If you go out and you spend $1 million to invest in a tiny bachelor apartment condo in the sky that has such poor construction quality that it's not going to last more than 40 or 50 years, you need to find a tenant to pay that. Your overhead costs, if you spent $1 million on a mortgage and on the monthly maintenance fees for this condominium, are going to be like $2,500, $3,000. You need to find someone who can pay $2,500, $3,000 a month to live in that bachelor. And there just aren't any more people who can do that. We've reached the limit. We've literally opened up the market to the whole globe. We've literally had people doubling up, quadrupling up their incomes in order to afford these homes. They're too small. The wages are not high enough. It's just not working anymore. The idea that we've doubled the last time we could double in the logarithmic expansion of real estate prices relative to wages and everything else in the economy. And that doubling was one doubling too far, and we have to bring it back down. That's going to mean that massive numbers of mortgages are going to have to collapse. We're going to have to see just a major economic restructuring in the country. And it's got to happen. Like, there's no other way we can do it. People who don't own homes are giving every penny that they're making in labor to rent right now. Like, right now, even people who have mortgages are paying every penny just to keep up with the interest on their outrageous mortgages. And then the monthly maintenance costs on these condos are spiking all the time too. Everywhere in the country, everybody is spending every penny they can to keep up with just the roof over their heads. And it's gotten so bad that, like I showed you, we're starting to see homeless people in homeless camps have to pay rent to survive. There's already been a catastrophic spike in homelessness across the country. Homeless encampments are everywhere. People are living in tents. Everybody's just barely hanging on. I am barely hanging on, barely paying my rent, and oh my God, it's just horrifying. The cost of living everywhere else is going up as a result. That means restaurants and small businesses have to charge more for their goods and services because their rents have gone up, because the owners of their properties need to pay those mortgages. It's just, the whole system's crazy. It's falling apart. I don't know how we're going to get out of this. The government is doing the stupidest things. They're like, I know, let's just mandate that everyone split units into ever smaller units, and that'll somehow save the day. I know, let's just open up immigration so big that waves and waves of wealthy people from Asia will come into the country and save us from our mortgage crisis. I know, let's just try to accelerate construction, and let's just borrow federally to throw money at construction companies to build more housing. None of this is going to solve the problem. The only thing that's going to solve the problem is that everybody who is a homeowner loses 50% to 70% of their entire real estate value. Their portfolio of real estate across the country has to be split. It has to be completely halved or more. That's the only way we can get back to normal. Now, there are other countries that have entirely different economic systems that don't use real estate in the same way. Japan is one. Japan has a very interesting, this is a country that they have lots of natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes, landslides, torrential rainpour. They have an attitude about real estate that it's temporary. So there's a sense that when you buy a home, it's just for you and your generation. This is not a generational wealth investment unit. And that's a reasonable way to look at housing investment. It's a reasonable way to look at real estate. If you buy a home, the price of that home that you bought is commensurate to your salary. It's maybe 1 or 2 years worth of salary. And you should expect that home to last about 40 years, a working time. And then you should expect that home to be kind of falling apart and not worth anything anymore. And then you should expect that it would probably end up getting bulldozed and demolished, and a new home will be built for someone else. You're not expecting that home will be worth, your entire golden egg, your retirement fund. That's not how the Japanese economic system works. And that makes so much more sense. Even right now, I don't know anything about accounting, but I've heard that houses, they devalue them on a 40-year scale. So if you own a piece of land and you build a house on that piece of land, right here in Canada, probably in the States too, that whatever the cost of building that house was, say $75,000 in materials and labor to build your house, over 40 years in your ledger, in your accounting book, you devalue the physical house by 1/40th. So that 40 years after the year you built that house, the value of that physical construction unit, physical building, is $0. That's the value. So we kind of used to have this mentality in North America that physical homes should be valued at about 30, 40 years and then not worth anything. Obviously, land is a different story, the physical land itself, the property. But the physical buildings should be worth about 40 years worth. That seems to have just gone out the window. Nobody's thinking about real estate in those terms anymore. And when we talk about housing in Canada now, almost all of the housing that's being built is condominium housing. So this is not land. We're not talking about a piece of land with a home and a front yard built on it. We're talking about 40, 50, 60, 80-story towers in my neighborhood that are just sandwiched decks of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tiny, tiny, tiny little apartments. These are homes now, and they're built with such poor construction materials, they're not going to last more than 30 or 40 years. So, I mean, just the entire economic thing around real estate in Canada is so crazy. But the biggest problem is there's no motivation for anyone to deal with the problem because our political class are all wealthy homeowners. Every single elected person, representative in the country on all levels, pretty much, is a homeowner. Meanwhile, in the rest of the country, almost every under the age of 40, more than half of the country will never even have a mortgage, let alone own a home outright. More than half of people 40 and under have no means to get into the real estate market because it has exponentially doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled in value over and over and over again, that they will never, ever, ever get into it. And the other half of people under 40 who are in the real estate market, it's more than likely it's because they inherited it through family generational wealth being passed down. If they didn't inherit the homes themselves, they inherited the wealth that enabled them to get into the real estate market. If not, then they're probably over the age of 40. They're probably 45, 50. Those are the youngest people who are able to buy homes on their own dime in this day and age. So that's the problem. Everybody who's elected doesn't want to lose their own investment value. They don't want to lose half of their half of their nest egg, half of their portfolio, half of their assets value or more to disappear if we recalibrate real estate values across the country. And the other half need that to happen because housing can't be an investment vehicle and a necessary good at the same time. There's no more necessary good than having a roof over your head. More than milk and eggs and water and everything else, you need a roof over your head. So an essential good like a home has to be affordable, has to have rental prices that are commensurate to the median wage. And you also have to have housing for lower wage people and higher wage people and everything else. Disabled people, seniors, you need all kinds of housing at all kinds of price points. But the entire economy of Canada revolves around housing being an investment vehicle. So that anytime rents go down and housing prices go down, the wealthy panic and say that this is a crisis. And then at the same time, they pay lip service when they say that the prices are too high. Like, you can't have it both ways. There's a sort of built into this system as a class war that those who are in the real estate system, who have assets in real estate, who own titles or who have mortgages, have a deep incentive to keep everyone who isn't already in out. And this is dangerous because this is not a luxury. These are essential goods. This is the roofs over our heads. We can't just let Canadians become homeless and live in tents because we don't want to let our nest eggs go away. But what are we going to do? Because this is like all of the country's GDP. If there were to be someday at the snap of a finger, like Thanos's snap, but it would be a snap, not cutting half of the population in half, but making half of the real estate value disappear in a Thanos snap. What would that do to the country's economy overall? It would catastrophically destroy it. It would destroy us. I couldn't even tell you what the reverberations would look like if there was a snap of a finger and we just took every single piece of property value across the country from coast to coast and cut them in half. Even though something like that needs to happen. And I should clarify, there's a crisis, especially in Toronto and Vancouver, in terms of real estate costs, but it's everywhere in the country. There are no boondocks you can move out to if you can't afford to live in the cities anymore. There is no housing anywhere in the country that is affordable. And of course, not all jobs are mobile. So you can't just kick people out of the cities if they can't afford the outrageous city rents and send them off to the Yukon to live in the Arctic Circle or something in an igloo. Like, that's not how the working economy works. So like this whole thing, there's no solution to it. There's no solution that's just like, oh, everybody should just move to small towns where it's cheaper. Small towns aren't cheaper anymore. There's no solution like, oh, we should just bring up immigration. That's not helping. We can't build enough real estate fast enough. And assuming that new immigrants will be so wealthy that they can buy all the housing and keep the mortgages going isn't doing anything for the people who are here now. And building new housing isn't solving the problem either, because we already have tens of thousands of units. Right now, there are skyscrapers that have just been built, 50, 60, 70-story skyscrapers, and the units are owned. There are mortgages on them, but they're investment properties, and people aren't renting them out to tenants. They're sitting empty because tenants can't afford the rents that they're offering. $3,000 a month for these tiny units. And the owners buy them anyways in the hope that someone further down the road will buy this real estate, because we're caught in this idea that real estate always spikes in value. It's crazy. So right now, the one hope we've had is that we've been trying, the Bank of Canada, which is our sort of financial regulator, has kept the national benchmark for interest rates really, really high in order to keep inflation down and to try to cool down the real estate market. But it's not nearly enough. Like, that's not going to solve the problem. Right now, the interest rates are sitting at about 5%. And already most people can't afford their mortgages, which is crazy. Interest rates used to be 20%, and that was normal. And now people can't afford 5%. And we're talking about like catastrophic real estate Armageddon over 5%. They should go back up to 20. I swear to fucking God. Like, the whole real estate system needs like a catastrophic shaking up. There is no way this country can keep going like this. It cannot keep going where just to live with a roof over your head, you're paying all of your wage, even if you're making middle class wages, middle income, median income. It's just, the country cannot function in this way. There has to be a reckoning. Like, I don't know how else this country is ever going to get itself out of this. So it's horrible. There's a cost of living crisis. Everyone in Canada's penniless. No one can afford to go out. No one can afford their groceries. Everyone's just giving all of their money into the beast of real estate. And the few people who still have jobs, it's all like construction or real estate management, or, it's all in the real estate. It's crazy. It's just, it's going to have to be a reckoning, I swear. So that's my rant. End of rant. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming to my